All right, today's topic is understanding and fighting monopoly power. I am Deputy Director of a new antitrust center here out at Yale, and I'm originally from Eastern Iowa. And Lauren is the Director of Special Projects at the Wisconsin Farmers Union.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today to talk about this important issue. Austin's going to kick things off by giving us a little bit of a background about monopoly power and how we got in the situation we're in.
Perfect. And also, I have to say, it's also nice to do this with Lauren. We met a few years ago at the Wisconsin Farmers Union State Convention. Okay. So just to kind of set this conversation, I want to talk about frameworks. Just do a little history of how we got to this moment of the concentration in the American economy to the point now where the American meat industry is more concentrated than when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. So I like to look at the New Deal, and to me, the New Deal is a good example of ecological balance. It's like when we put up guardrails in our economy to balance food production from making sure farmers had good prices, consumers paid a good price, companies were getting good price as well, and then we're also balancing the ecological needs of the ecosystem. At the same time, we had this competition antitrust framework rooted in Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court justice. I'm kind of using these characters to kind of tell these kind of frameworks, and then kind of fast forward to this era we're living in now, neoliberalism, second Gilded Age, whatever you want to call it. It's basically a laissez-faire. You deregulate, power concentrates. And you see it in the Farm Bill through the story of Earl Butz, and then we see it in antitrust and competition through the story of Robert Bork. You might know him most famously as Nixon's hatchet man. He was willing to fire Archibald on that Friday because he was promised a Supreme Court seat. I would question someone's character on that behavior, and that is his framework is what has taken hold for antitrust in America. Kind of the hope I personally have in moments like this is I actually view this as very cyclical. You have moments where laissez-faire basically run things into the ground. Things break, we re-regulate things, put up guardrails again, and you just kind of see this shifting. And so part of this also is having a conversation over what to do next. Once we move past the second Gilded Age era, what should our markets look like? So on that note, let's do a real quick history of the Farm Bill. And I actually like to use hogs as an example of concentration of power, because I think it's one of the most broken agriculture markets, and it just demonstrates these principles of what happens when you deregulate markets. So what you essentially see is most people working in hog slaughterhouses, including former members of my family, or I shouldn't say former, both my grandpas used to work at hog slaughterhouses. Both of those slaughterhouses have now closed, but workers essentially haven't seen a wage increase in the last 30, 40 years. You're seeing for every dollar you spend at the grocery store, what the hog farmer takes home is at the record low. We've also seen the collapse of a lot of the hog family farms. I know my state of Iowa, we've lost about 90 of them since the election of President Reagan. But what's happening is you're seeing all this power and money concentrate up top to where the CEO, the owner of Smithfield, WH Group of China, he made $291 million in 2017. So what you're seeing is you're just seeing this big sucking of all the money and wealth being generated in these communities to these outside actors, to these CEOs. So USDA was founded by Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln, as the People's Department. And so generally speaking, it was pretty inactive in the farm space until World War I came along, because generally there was boom and bust cycles. But as a lot of the farm fields in Europe were taken out of production because of the war, President Wilson encouraged American farmers to really fill that void, help our allies by providing them the food they need to fight their war. In your classic, boom and bust thing, the markets collapse afterwards. Coupled in, you add in the Great Depression. You see what we saw. The Great Depression had already started in rural communities and was only compounded by the Great Depression. And then you have the tragedy of commons kick in, where when market prices are low, you see people even plant more, push their land more, just so they can even save and maintain their land. And the Dust Bowl is actually a good example of this ecological breaking point. This is marginal land pushed too far and it broke. And so filling that void comes in the new President Franklin Roosevelt and this like New Deal, what I call Farm Bill framework, rooted in balance. Henry Wallace of Iowa was the Secretary of Agriculture, and it's really predicated or rooted in this kind of like triangle of doing price income supports, crop insurance, and conservation payments. And a lot of these are tied to each other, where in order to get one, you have to do the other. And so it's supply management. There's different words to call it, but that's just kind of the framework of is trying to figure out balance. I should note, though, that this was very much a white-centric framework, especially in the South. Black sharecroppers got none of this. So what basically happened is Southern Democrats were very powerful during the New Deal era, and the laws were in such a way where the money was administered at the county level. It's not shocking that in Alabama, the county administrators were racist. They basically, they give the money to the white landowner. The black farmers did most of the work anyways, but they didn't get any of it. They were kicked off the land. And a lot of the story of the Great Migration you see play out because of this. I highly recommend this book, The Warmth of Other Suns, that tells this story. I love this. This is a speech President Harry Truman gave in Dexter, Iowa. It was about an hour due west of Des Moines at the national, I think it was like plowing convention. And it was in front of like an audience of 50,000 in a farm field. And then it was broadcast nationwide. Quote, "It is terribly dangerous to let any one group get too much power in the government. We cannot afford to let one group share the nation's policies in its own interest at the expense of others. That is what happened in the 1920s under the big business world of Republicans. Those were the days when the big corporations had things their own way. The policies that Wall Street big businesses wanted were the policies that the Republicans adopted. Agriculture, labor, and small businesses played second fiddle while big businesses called the tune." I can go to Dexter, Iowa and give this same exact speech now. My point in this speech is there will always be, like, corporations do not want to compete. It is not profitable. The little example I thought of in my head this morning preparing for this talk was near my parents' home in Cedar Rapids, we're 3 gas stations when I was young. Now one got demolished and is now Walgreens. Another one got demolished is now a Flowerama, 2 chain stores. And then the third one is now Casey's. What used to be 3 independently gas stations that were competing all the time and trusting my parents would always pick their gas, which one had the lowest price, are gone. And now you have Casey's dominating that marketplace. And so companies, we know competition is volatile. It's not profitable. So businesses will do whatever they can to amass power and reduce competition. And so you will always see people come along who will do the bidding of corporate interests and try to break any regulations that they see harming or hindering profitability. Fast forward to 1996. I like to kind of use that New Deal Farm Bill as one bookend, and then what I call the Wall Street Farm Bill, which is the 1996 Farm Bill. Basically, President Clinton signed into law what President Reagan and Bush weren't able to do but wanted to do. And that was essentially deregulate the farm bill sector. So a lot of these little things where in order to get one thing to do another were gone, limit caps were raised. The whole point in this is now we have a system that is not designed for farmers, workers, or honestly, even eaters in America. It's really designed for Wall Street. And what I mean by that is the whole goal is for Pepsi to pay the least amount possible to make chips and pop, and for Smithfield to pay the least amount possible to buy hogs and slaughter them. It does not care about these rural communities. And so everyone talks about Earl Butz in this space as, Nixon's deregulator. I mean, he was just a protege of Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson. Purdue under Trump is no different. I mean, there are always going to be these people that come out of industry that just do what's best for industry. I think the way we see this play out in the grocery store is best to look at the beverage aisle. This is from the Target nearby me. Pop's $1.80. Cranberry cocktail juice, basically the same price, which I did not realize until I made this slide that it's actually more unhealthy for you than pop. I was always told by my mom growing up cranberries are healthy. And then you go to carrot juice, and carrot juice is way higher at $6. Well, keep in mind, the Farm Bill is heavily subsidizing a few key crops, not everything. So corn is heavily subsidized. And so the production of pop and cranberry juice, because let's be honest, even though cranberries are supply management, most of what cranberry cocktail juice is, it's corn syrup, sugar, whatever. And so, if I walk into Walmart to go, or Hy-Vee, pick your grocery store to buy groceries, the system pushes you towards buying pop and cranberry juice because it's way cheaper. What this means for America is, as we deregulated our farm bill system, you see obesity rates take off. There's this really good book called Weighing In that talks about this, where for so long we've framed obesity in America as a personal choice thing, a personal failing, where really it's structural. You have to have money in America to eat healthy. Walk into a Dollar General and you'll see what I'm saying. And then what we're seeing now is an explosion of obesity rates. This was from a recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking forward, predicting obesity rate levels for the next 10 years. I mean, if you just look at overweight, most Americans will be overweight. Overall, only about 20% will be a normal body weight within the next 10 years. It would hit female, Black, lower incomes, female, Black women the hardest. And then you just see the geographic thing play out, and you just see class and race play out in this epidemic. I should also say what this system does is it pushes produce production offshore. So two really good examples of that was the LA Times did a really good thing called it was about the movement of tomato production in America to Baja California. Kind of like t-shirts, where like t-shirts used to be made in North Carolina, America. We moved it to China, where you subcontract it. That way you can exploit the labor and environment, but because it's so far removed, it's really hard to document. And the reason why this current Wall Street Farm Bill framework does that is because it's heavily subsidizing few crops. The ones that aren't subsidized, it makes sense to take your field that used to be tomatoes and put it into corn. On top of it, as we work to elevate or treat labor better in America, what you're also doing, unless you adjust the trade agreements, you're pushing that labor offshore. We're seeing that in New York State now, where they're trying to, improve the farmer worker quality. But then that organic farmer in New York State trying to do the right thing is then further hindered against organic farmer in Baja California. So going to competition policy, I root a lot of what I consider balance is rooted in Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis was the son of a grain miller in Kentucky, became a lawyer. And his two big fears were he did not like concentrated power. His whole thing was you want to push down power as much as possible. You want to structure things to push down power. But at the same time, he really did not like non-organic growth. And what I mean by that is a lot of corporations get big by acquisition after acquisition after acquisition. Just to define two quick terms, vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical integration is like the supply chain from grain to milling it, feeding it to livestock, that whole thing. And then horizontal is just, if you're just the slaughterhouse and you want to buy all the slaughterhouses in the space. So it's classic to reduce competition. Companies make vertical plays where, if you're a slaughterhouse, you buy the livestock. And you're seeing that now with, Smithfield now owns 1 in 5 hogs in America. Walmart's getting into the dairy business, Costco's getting into the chicken business. And an example of horizontal integration is when, when Tyson's bought Iowa beef processors. I think as what a market could be, a really good example is actually alcohol. Just for background, my dad used to be a beer distributor, so I grew up in this world. So what happened was before Prohibition is a lot of breweries were fully vertically integrated. And so what they would do is basically sell their product at a loss or at cost to get you drunk. And then they make their money on gambling, prostitution, and other hard drugs. And then, but because of that alcoholism, that drunkenness that they were pushing, you had all these societal ills that led to the Prohibition movement, which I really encourage people to watch that Ken Burns film on it. But when America then legalized alcohol, what we did is we highly regulated, we structured these markets. We put in these hard red lines where if you're a brewer, a distributor, and a retailer, these are 3 different things. That's why you see like Anheuser-Busch. My dad worked at a company called Flex Sales, and then you see your beer sold at Woodman's. There are exceptions for craft breweries where you can kind of get away from this 3-tiered system. But what you're seeing in the classic sense is there is a wine baron named Dave Tronk who spent $25 million to get elected to Congress in Maryland. He owns a company you might have seen strip malls called Total Wine. And what Total Wine's trying to vertically integrate. And so it's financing lawsuits to undermine this system. This in an extreme example, I want to talk about IG Farben. IG Farben was a chemical monopoly. Fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer was one of their things they made. They were the single largest financer of Hitler. Hitler walked into a room and says, "Oh, I don't mean, what I'm saying about the Jews. I'll help you sell more stuff." They gave him a check. And then there's a really good book called Hell's Cartel that tells this story. I mean, Auschwitz was built actually for IG Farben as a factory, and the concentration camp was to supply the labor. After World War II, a big thing of the US was antitrust enforcement, competition policy, as we realized these spaces were really cartelized and concentrated industry. I mean, that company had so much power in Germany, it helped finance that fascist, was reducing that power. So the American forces came in, we broke up IG Farben into, I believe, 7 companies. One of them is modern day Bayer, which recently, and what it's kind of resembling like the Mama Bell, when the US government broke up Ma Bell into little companies and they basically are reformulating themselves. You're seeing a similar process take hold here. But I think IG Farben is a really good example of what can go worst case scenario, what can go wrong with when unchecked power goes unchecked. Power goes unchecked. And then to fast forward to where we are now, competition policy in America, I love this thing right here because you see it's a bipartisan thing where every politician talks about how they love small businesses. Yet every president since Reagan on both sides of the party had basically pushed a antitrust framework that does the opposite of small business. That actually hurts small businesses. And what I mean by that is going back to Robert Bork. Robert Bork took this whole Louis Brandeis notion of pushing down power and says, it's okay if companies are big. As long as you can prove that consumer prices go down if you buy a company, then you can merge. They called this the consumer welfare standard. Well, guess what? You can find any economist to produce numbers saying, if I'm Sprint and I buy T-Mobile, consumers will pay less in prices. It's just funny. I mean, it's just funny numbers. We're trying to use a pseudoscience, Excel numbers to mask moral judgments over how big should companies be. There's a story I highlight right there by ProPublica. No, sorry, that's different. There's been stories where some of these economists are making like $100 million, doing this game. And then you have this whole judicial philosophy financed by robber barons pushing this intellectual framework to take hold through the Federalist Society, those kind of judges. It's just laissez-faire. That's all this is. They use a lot of, it took me a while personally to realize it was all mostly pseudoscience and snake oil because they use a lot of jargon, but they're really not saying much. And I mean, you just see the reality play out where there's this great Consumer Reports investigation where they called a bunch of drugstores for 5 common drugs and say, how much would it cost? Your local mom and pop was the cheapest by far. Whereas you go to Walgreens and CVS, it was, instead of spending 107 at your local one, it was 752 and then 928 at CVS. In response, Consumer Reports went to these companies and go, what's going on here? CVS or Walgreens says you didn't use our coupons. Even with the coupons, the prices are still higher than your local pharmacy. My whole point here is this whole philosophy failed to even deliver in its basic premise of lowering consumer prices. Just making this bigger point of tying together this whole neoliberalism, second Gilded Age is just rooted in power concentrated into the few up top. And what we see this play out in the agriculture space is going back to Brandeis's fear of inorganic growth. Smithfield didn't get big because it was the best hog producer. It was acquisition after acquisition after acquisition. Philip Howard is a great academic in this space who just has tons of these great charts just showing it from beer to seeds to meat. And then here's an example of this is hog slaughterhouse capacity for the highest ranking one, the second ranking company, Smithfield and JBS. I should also first note that both of these are non-American companies. They're actually foreign-owned, state-backed monopolies. Smithfield is quasi-owned by the Chinese state, and JBS is quasi-owned by the Brazilian state. And what you see is not only is there Smithfield, but then there's also all these different brands. They also own farmland, Premium Standard, Pine Ridge Farms. From a purely labor standpoint, it's really hard to organize. It's one thing if you can, you muster enough people to organize the plant in Denison, Iowa. But when a company has 12 other plants, You have no work. You have way less bargaining power if they had 2 or 3. Just taking in the organic space, Whole Foods was the same thing. Acquisition after acquisition after acquisition, to even the most, I think it's comically funny at this point that Jeff Bezos now owns it, because for so long, a lot of intellectual or thought leaders in this space said you can change the system with your fork. And then you walk into Whole Foods, not only is it owned by the world's richest man, who's basically a modern day Sears catalog. Almost a lot of the brand items you see there are not what you think they are. And for that, I will turn this over to Lauren.
Yeah, thank you for that history, Austin. And from there, we're gonna kind of take the turn of how is all of this playing out today. So I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time on this particular slide, but just this is a graphic depiction of exactly what we're looking at these days. If you're not familiar with market concentration graphs like these, which you probably aren't, and that's okay. I farm in Wisconsin, and these are something that are kind of new to me too. But if you look at each of the squares on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see different aspects of the industry. And I just picked a handful that I thought were kind of interesting. And you'll see the top 4 companies that are existing in that sphere. And underneath where you see the CR4 or CR3, that's the concentration ratio of those companies, either 3 or 4 companies. And so what you see here is in beef processing, for example, the top 4 companies own 73% of the marketplace. In pork, 67, chicken, 54, cold cereal, which is a big buyer of a lot of grains, we've got 83%. Retail grocery, we're down to those 4 big people or big companies owning 45%, and in seeds we're at 50%. And all of these are continuing to concentrate. It's not like this is static. This is continuing to happen, continuing to grow. And as we get more and more concentrated at these higher and higher levels, it actually impacts us as farmers because we have fewer and fewer choices of who we buy our seeds from, who we buy our tractors from, and where we sell those items. You hear the term monopoly pretty often, or oligopoly, which is a couple of companies existing in a sphere. But another issue is what's called a monopsony or an oligopsony, which is the buyer end of things when they are getting concentrated as well. And we can go to the next slide. Can you go to the next slide, Austin? I'm sorry. And this is also impacting the organic sector, is something that I just want to highlight. It's very easy for us to talk about the entire world, the entire country, the entire conventional agricultural systems. They're easy to target. It's a little bit harder to hold up the mirror and look at the organic industry and see how this is happening to us, and see how these companies are starting to move into the organic sector and impact us directly, even if we don't think of them as organic companies. So I just highlighted, a couple of very simple examples here, but a couple of years back, there was a bit of a kerfuffle when the Organic Trade Association decided to bring in a couple of these big companies because they now have organic lines and they are becoming players in the industry. Also recent news that popped up in my news feed were that Bell and Evans and Cargill are working together with a couple of nonprofit partners to increase organic corn and soybeans, but obviously through a contracted marketplace. And so just looking at those squares again through the center of this slide, you see where BASF and Cargill are playing out on soybean processing, for example. Beef processing, those agrochemicals, they're big players. And I think we all know that, but it's important to think about how big they are, how much of the market they dominate. And so as they step into, for example, the organic sector with contracts for buying those soybeans that they're going to be processing and a contracted buyer, we need to worry about how that's going to impact our ability to get good prices on these things and to compete in those marketplaces as smaller producers. Austin, can we go to the next slide? And just one more example, as a meat producer myself, I raise grass-fed beef and lamb. I am very interested in this meat sector piece in particular. And as we know, there are 4 big companies that are in this sector, and the 2 biggest, JBS and Tyson. I did just a little bit of digging, certainly not enough, and I'm sure this is not their entire organic line. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that even when they're looking for that USDA certified organic at their grocery store, the average consumer is not thinking about the fact that they're not choosing a different company, they're choosing the same company. And with that, I'll hand it back to Austin for a little bit and then circle back with a little bit of what we can do about it.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I love those C4 numbers because you can show it to anyone and you get right away that you look at the visual and you're like, oh, that's not competitive, or like, that's very concentrated. But those numbers are incredibly hard to find. And that's intentional. One of the first things President Reagan's FTC did at the encouragement of the Chamber of Commerce was stop a publication of a lot of these figures. So even though we're looking at, there's some of the figures that are out there, those are national. But imagine what they are like in the state you live in. A lot of times too, these companies carve up regionally. I know that for the nitrogen fertilizer market, I mean, they could most likely are doing that for the hog market. And so just something I encourage you to personally do is, even working with state legislators to produce C4 numbers for your state and for your industry, because it's hard to even have a conversation over something we don't even know about. I like to use peanut butter because this says so much about 2021 when there's big peanut. We have a peanut butter concentration problem. One company, J.M. Smuckers, controls about 46, 47% of the market. Again, numbers here aren't great. This is all based on when you scan at the checkout. The reason why those numbers aren't great is a lot of times the companies do the private label brand, so we're not capturing that market share. So I would assume this market share is even higher. But the point here is this illusion of choice is, what these companies realize is instead of having just one, this isn't just Standard Oil and their Standard Oil. It's you segment the market because that Whole Food shopper likes to pretend they're getting different peanut butter than the Dollar General, shopper. And so, what a lot of these companies do is they just have different basically products for different market segments. And so, J.M. Smucker, the market peanut butter monopolist or dominant player here has, they make Santa Cruz organic line, they make Adams all natural, Jiffy, Loris, Smucker's, Gobbler, all that kind of stuff. And I should also say, this is even personally hard for me to keep track of, but there was a point last year where every single protein in America was under investigation for price fixing, because when industries are this concentrated, it's really, really easy to act like a cartel. What we've seen now in the last few months is a lot of these are making settlements. They're nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Companies pay $100 million, say we won't do this again. I really doubt that because structures didn't change. And here's a great graph just visualizing for every dollar, as I mentioned earlier, consumers spend in the store, what percent do farmers get? And what I find really fascinating is here's what you see right on the cusp of the New Deal Farm Bill is you see that low of 30, but then after that framework takes hold, we see the highest recorded percent farmers ever got. At the very end of where Harry Truman gave that speech in Dexter, Iowa, around, was it 52, 53 cents of every dollar? And then we just see the systematic collapse of it over time. The reason why this is a little detailed, but the reason why the lines are different colors is there was a slight methodology change. Here's a random little factoid, which I find really fascinating is a lot of the local supply chains have collapsed. We should have much more diversity in our production systems. And what I mean by that is there's this great, I encourage you from whatever state you're from to look at, the WPA of the New Deal created all these guides of their states, almost like it's like a little bit Wikipedia and a little bit like travel guides. And so I found the one for Iowa and I read the agriculture section, and there used to be much more regional produce production in Iowa. So like the eastern part of the state over by Davenport used to be onions. There's muscatine melons. On the western side used to be grapes. Southern used to be peaches. Northern used to be beets. And what you see you also see this in this Wall Street Journal chart where a lot of farms are very diverse operations. And what we've seen happen is since then is that whole thing has collapsed. Of all the things I've said in Iowa, the only one that I know of that's still kind of standing are muscatine melons. And it's almost like it's kind of like, in retirement, they tell you diversify your retirement savings, buy different stocks. It's almost like we, in the agriculture system, broadly speaking, have put it all in one. We put it all on Enron. Most farms, a lot of large operations are only doing 1, 2, or 3 crops at a time, which makes them very volatile. What you've seen in this system is a lot of people, it just incentivizes, it pushes you, the margins are so little, it's either get big, go home. You're seeing massive land consolidation. So I mean, you see the average size of a farm just skyrocket as this deregulation system takes hold. It makes it incredibly expensive for any non-farm. If you want to farm and you don't come from a farm family, you basically cannot afford to buy farmland. And then what you've seen is also the rise of, I don't want to say land barons, but like, I mean, you have the Resnick family in California. They're farmers, but they live in Hollywood. They own all those pistachios you see in grocery stores. They own like pomegranate juices. The amount of farmland they own is equivalent to 13 Manhattans. And I should also update this slide at this point now because there's even a larger farmland owner in America, and his name is Bill Gates. What we've seen in this system too is basically the collapse of a lot of traditional family meat and dairy farms. You've seen in Iowa, I call him the piggy baron. This number 4 right here, Iowa Select Farms. He owns, 250,000 sows, which I think they move about 5 million pigs a year. So that's one man now owns 5 million pigs. But the largest owner, as I mentioned earlier, is Smithfield of China. They own about 1 million sows. And you think about what that means for rural communities when there was once 12 family farms doing meat and dairy production, when it becomes 1 or 2. And the health of those communities, especially now that my piggy baron has a home down in Naples. So he's sucking all that money out of Iowa to take down to Florida. You're also seeing just really weird, none of this is logical. That's the other point I try to make is, I mean, you look at dairy. I mean, the fact that New Mexico does 3 times more dairy than Vermont just doesn't make sense. I mean, New Mexico is desert. And for example, what that looks like here is if you Google Clovis, New Mexico, all around it, you see all these kind of like these big feedlots, and they're dairy feedlots. I actually drove by one when I was driving the Southwest because I want to see this in person. You have happy cows on grass in Vermont, and then you have this. Well, this system is heavily subsidized. The one in Vermont isn't. This one, the dirty secret in all these is they're using undocumented labor. It's subsidized water. They're taking water from an aquifer that's not sustainable. They're subsidized feed. A lot of times the CAFO or a lot of the environmental stuff is heavily subsidized. You can get subsidies through the conservation program now for your manure ponds. And so this is it's hard for the family farm doing a robust operation to compete on price against a model like this. And then what we see too is the exploitation of labor in this system as it has less and less power. And there's a lot of great books that talk about this, if this is something you're interested in diving deep more into. Just in an Iowa context is from what you've seen is as this framework takes hold and power consolidates, you have a lot of the wealth in rural communities is just being sucked out. And what you're seeing happen in America is a rise of what I call the superstar cities. It used to be, if you look in 1980s, living in Eastern Iowa or Western Wisconsin was no different than living in LA in terms of per capita income. You had the few little rich areas of DC and New York, and you fast forward to 2023, these are different worlds. You have these corridors of power that take off Minneapolis, San Francisco, those, and you just see two Americas separate. And you're not even seeing that between urban and rural, you're seeing it between urban areas. I mean, you take a place like St. Louis and all the big companies, including Anheuser-Busch, have been consolidated out. And then what that means for society when you lose those institutional actors. Not institutional actors, but your local corporation. And then you're seeing a lot of these rural communities or mid-sized towns. You're seeing crime take off. You're just seeing all these negative things fill this void with low wages and the loss of opportunity. And then I want to kind of drill down what I mean by dignity and what happens when you lose that local employer is I think you see there's a town called Keokuk, Iowa. It's in southeast Iowa. It's where Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa meet. And the young man did his college research project on on his hometown and the state of its businesses. When you look in the 1960s, about half the local businesses were locally owned. You fast forward to 2016 and none of them were anymore. And what that means for local town, when your businesses consolidate out, is you don't have the person that, when the local business, you lose that person who finances the nonprofits. You lose that sense of dignity for the workers where, at times might be tough, but, you're willing to shave a little bit or, eat a little bit of the money because your kids on the same soccer team. If you're management and your workers on the assembly line, they play soccer together. But when they're just a number on an Excel sheet, you lose that empathy and that humanity. There's a candy company in Iowa. They make those little trolley gummy things. It got consolidated out, and then literally days before Christmas, a candy company fired all their employees. Instead of having any sense of decency, at least even waiting until February, January after the holidays, these people were ruthless enough, because these people were not people. They were numbers on an Excel sheet by some consultant, in Minneapolis or something. So kind of going to where we are now is you're seeing this momentum at the grassroots build for tackling this consolidation. There was a Heartland Forum I helped organize in Iowa at the start of this prior presidential race. We brought together a lot of candidates to talk about this. What you had is pretty much every candidate on the Democrat field, including Vice President Biden, have an agriculture antitrust platform in their policy. And I'll let Lauren take it for you to kind of talk a bit more about what Senator Klobuchar and other things going on.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go too in depth in this particular antitrust enforcement bill, but I think just to kind of piggyback on what Austin is saying, we're starting to see that people are sick of this, and it's impacting our communities to such a level that it can't be ignored anymore. If you live in a rural area, you probably know that there aren't a lot of economic opportunities locally. And as we now have heard, there are a lot of structural reasons why that's the case. There's a lot of reason why bigger companies have consolidated, moved their headquarters to larger areas, and really decreased wages and made things pretty hard for people. And it's because that's their incentive structure. They benefit from that, and they don't have to be concerned with the rest of us. And so what we're seeing now is enough people are starting to bring this up and get loud about it that politicians are starting to have to deal with it a little bit. And so, in the last few years, there have been a few bills that have been put forward on ag merger moratoriums and such. None of those have been reintroduced yet this year, and I am not our policy expert at WFU, but we do have some good ones who are watching these things, and they did highlight that this bill has recently been introduced. And, here in Wisconsin, we have some exciting opportunities in the coming few years with Tammy Baldwin being on the Ag Appropriations Committee and some other just exciting opportunities to start talking about these things. And if we start talking now, by the time we get to our next farm bill, there's a chance that we could have some really strong language and actually start creating some change, especially around this corporate consolidation issue. We can go to the next slide. This one's you. A favorite quote.
Yeah, I love this quote. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. The struggle may be a moral one, or maybe a physical one, or maybe both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without it. Demanded, never did, and never will. This is why grassroots activism is so important. Cargill is not just going to give up power. Smithville is not just going to give up power. The piggy baron in Iowa is not going to give up power. And just to add on to Lauren's point, is what I love about this too is it's incredibly bipartisan. It can be incredibly bipartisan. The Trump it should be, yes. Historically it is. It's honestly, it's one of the few things at our Thanksgiving table that everyone in the family can agree on, is there's just unchecked corporate consolidation in America, and people are just fed up with it.
So with that said, what do we do? And I saw that a question came through, okay, we get it. What do we do? And that is a big part of this. We can't just get lost in all of the heaviness, the weight of things not working. Oops, we lost our screen, I think. And so I happen to work for Wisconsin Farmers Union, and I am a proud member of Wisconsin Farmers Union. And I think one of the important things for us all to do is to get organized. I think it's the most important thing for us to do. So Wisconsin Farmers Union works on 3 basic principles, and that slide's coming back, so I'm not worried, but it's educate, cooperate, and legislate. And so as we think about those pieces of this organization that's been around for getting close to 100 years now, we've been building power amongst farmers for over 80 years. And we hope to be doing that for a long time. We've found these 3 levers of legislation, cooperation, and education to be extremely valuable. And here you all are at the Moses Conference, the Growing Stronger Together Conference, getting your education together, getting your tools in your toolbox and making networks and building those muscles for yourself. But after this conference, as you head into your next year and beyond, we need to focus on some of these other pieces. We need to figure out how to be collaborative with our neighbors. We need to think about our business structures and where we can develop cooperatives or just cooperative efforts, even if they're not a formal cooperative. And we need to get this legislation under control. I did put a map on this slide of the US. Every state that's in green is a state that has a farmers union. Every state that's tan is a state that has at-large membership. So if you're interested, you don't have to be in Wisconsin to join this organization and get involved in this group. And there are other organizations too. I just happen to be a big fan of this one because of our national power. It's a democratic organization. So every year we gather to vote on our policy book. And that means that our big tent of a lot of different farmers with a lot of different ideas have to come to some agreement on what's the most important and how we're going to attack it. And it's a really powerful experience to participate in actual democracy that way. And because we're a national organization, we can link arms with other states and we can get a lot done. So that's next slide, please. That said, we have a couple of things that our membership have determined are really important in this coming year. They're called our special orders of business. And so I put those here along with a little cartoon. We had a fun year this last year, hiring some political cartoonists to work with some of our policy and get the message out in a little bit more visual way. But one of our big priorities is better antitrust enforcement. So let's think about that a little bit. What can that look like? Certainly breaking up the existing monopolies. We have legislation in place that would do what we need it to do. We just need to be enforcing that legislation. And as you heard from Austin, there have been times in our history where we have broken up the monopolies. It's time for us to just go ahead and do that again. And along with that, I'd mentioned ag merger moratoriums as an example, but we need to block these mega mergers until we have a better system in place for protecting smaller production, smaller companies, smaller processors, and really our hometowns. We also need to rebalance, I should say, the power of people over corporations. You know, there are a lot of things that we've done in the last decade or two here that have really unbalanced our power against the corporation, as Austin talked about. So we need to be looking at how do we get fair prices? How do we get fair wages? What do we need to do in our campaign finance reform to get those corporations a little bit less powerful in our political sphere and get our voter a little bit more powerful? And certainly federal tax reform can fall under that as well. But there's also this corporate accountability piece. We talked about those CR4 or CR3 cubes, squares. We need market transparency. We need to know who's paying what and who's getting that money. We need to know where they're located, if they're foreign or domestic. A lot of our members talk about cool country of origin labeling. It would be great to know if our meat is coming from Montana or Brazil and whether it's impacting deforestation in the rainforest or a family farmer. It's a big problem, and really transparency needs to happen in order for us to even start to untangle what the real issues are. And along with that, we need to safeguard against unfair, anti-competitive, abusive practices. We've been talking about labor, and certainly with the last year with COVID, we've seen, particularly in the meat processing sector, the way workers were treated with COVID. You know, corporations leadership actually gambling on how many deaths were going to happen. I mean, this is just appalling. And it's not the sort of behavior that any mom and pop scale butcher that I know, none of them would behave that way, because they actually have to care for the people that work with them. And if you have a limited workforce, you need to figure out how to keep them, because you can't just replace them with another cog. You need an actual good worker who you can train and work with in the long haul. So, you know, there are a lot of issues here that need to be resolved. And certainly we need to keep introducing better competition and antitrust legislation beyond what we already have in place to make sure that the enforcement continues to happen. Can we go to the next slide? And I'm going to let Austin talk about this one too, because this is another big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I view antitrust lawyers as cops on the beat. I encourage you, I mean, for example, take my home, Iowa. Just a few years ago, we had 0 antitrust lawyers on staff. They're one of the people in leadership there read an article about antitrust, and like, oh, we should hire someone. They hired one. Turns out there was too much work for just one person, and then they hired another one. I use this as an example of wherever you are, of encouraging, reaching out to your AG offices and lobbying through your organization or yourself personally to increase their staffing levels. Because so much of what antitrust is just having people go out there and investigate. And so, I mean, you're seeing a lot of, for the big tech, I mean, my hope for agriculture and antitrust is actually, there's so much national conversation over big tech, is let's make agriculture part 2. And you're seeing a lot of this leadership in this space on big tech coming out of New York. Well, it helps when they have 14 on staff. And so yeah, I just want to flag this. So this is what you can personally do in your own state, is lobby your AG to hire more attorneys.
And along with what you can do in your own state, here in Wisconsin, we have a governor's budget that was just recently announced. And I've got a graphic here of a couple of WFU's budget priorities as defined by our membership and our policy book. And you'll notice the only one that isn't in the governor's budget is antitrust enforcement staffing at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. So certainly we've been asking for an awful lot, and we've got most of it, but we're never quite satisfied. There's always a little bit more we can do. Next slide. Along with that, we are organizing farmers to get involved in this budgeting process. So if we're thinking about boots on the ground, our state isn't the only state that has a budgeting process. But Wisconsin Farmers Union is hosting a series of trainings to help farmers prepare themselves to give testimony at these budget hearings. And we have a couple of different groups within our membership who have already started some of this work in terms of telling their story about meat processing, for example, getting prepared to talk about healthcare in the state and what we want to see. And so along the top of this slide, I have just the Wisconsin budget process, which is, you know, fairly standard, but it's nice to see it all laid out and kind of see the pathway of where we need to be going as farmers. We don't need to be necessarily involved in every step along the way, but if each of us steps up and speaks up once or participates in a piece of this, calls our representatives, we have a good opportunity to actually push this over the finish line by the time we get to the end of that process. Next slide. And here are some of the other things that we're working on here in Wisconsin, our other special orders of business. You'll see consolidation in agriculture is something that we're very concerned about. So if you're also concerned, feel free to join us. We love more hands. But also that meat processing issue is a big deal. And so we're looking at different ways to support small scale and mid scale processing across the state and improve farmer access to that. And we don't quite know what it looks like right now. There are a lot of different ideas, and it may take a couple of different tacks, including, you know, involving workers in worker farmer co-ops and some of the other creative designs that have come throughout organizational history like ours. We're also looking at climate change and pandemic response and recovery. And I know, you know, climate change in particular with the organic audience that I know, it's a big deal. We need to be resilient. And that resilience comes in the form of not only the kind of weather we're dealing with day to day, but also the kind of marketplace and food structure that we're working with. Because if you only have one buyer left, you're not going to be able to be resilient with your business. You're not going to be able to grow the number of crops you need in your rotation and find the buyers. You're not going to be able to find the seeds. so these are all big issues impacting us, and we need to keep working on them. And I think I inadvertently did not say dairy policy reform, which, if you're familiar with our organization, that's also something near and dear to us here in Wisconsin. And we're having a huge issue with consolidation in that sector, as well as oversupply issues and pricing issues. And it's a wicked problem that needs a lot of help. And so we're happy to have you join us if you're interested. But beyond that, there are other pieces of the organization that are just part of our long history that we continue to work on. And those include that farmer labor solidarity. When we think about the coalition we need to build to make these changes, we need as many people on board as we can have. I saw a question roll through about how can consumers help? Just like laborers can help, just like farmers can help. We all need to be figuring out what our piece of, taking a bite out of this pie looks like, so that together, if we're all taking a bite, we actually accomplish it. We can't all be doing the same thing. And we're also very involved in just pro-democracy efforts. We want to make sure that people aren't gerrymandered into not having a voice. We want to make sure that everyone has equal access to their representation and doesn't have to have money to have a voice. We also want to make sure that everyone in rural communities are able to have vibrant access to things like broadband and healthcare and the other things that make life a little bit easier for people, especially entrepreneurs like farmers. So these are all things that we're working on, and certainly there's the potential to do a lot more, but we do all of this through collaboration. And I think too, it's also important to talk about the cooperation piece, because cooperatives have a long history within the agricultural sector. The ag organizers of the 1920s knew the importance of a cooperative, and in the 30s and 40s they helped those cooperatives grow and really created rural vibrant communities that were able to donate to the nonprofits in their area and help out with those school fundraisers and make rural life a better place. And that's something that we can bring back. We just need to put the elbow grease in. Next slide. So with that, I offer the call to join us. This is a billboard that we put up last summer, and it really speaks to me personally that, this is a bigger issue than just not liking a certain company. This is an issue of us losing our voice because we're being silent in the face of corporate power. So I encourage you all to step up and join us on this issue or any of the others that might be exciting to you. At the bottom of the slide, you can see Wisconsin Farmers Union or national. If you're not in the state, you can certainly look for your state as well. But I hope to see you at a future meeting, maybe on meat processing or antitrust enforcement.
One last note. I just want to say, I really want to applaud to the Wisconsin Farmers Union for being a national leader and trying to build a relationship with labor. To me, I think any reform in the food system will be rooted in that relationship. Because when we talk about the food system, not only the people that grow it, but also pick it, process it, transport it, cook it, serve it, all that stuff. You're talking about 1 in 10, 1 in 11 Americans. People like my mom who ran a bakery, people like my dad who's now an ethanol truck driver. And that's where the political power is. And just like on a kind of just also my personal final note is I actually find thinking about what a decentralized system could be to be one of the most optimistic things right now. It's a little cheesy to say, but there's no reason why Iowa shouldn't be the Italy of America. I mean, the Midwest, you know what I mean? We have the world's best farmland. This should be where people in America go for foodie, if you want to go on foodie tourism, all that kind of stuff. That's what the system could be. I mean, just imagine if your local school district, you could go to a local community college, major in culinary programs, work at your local school district, make a solid middle-class living instead of being contracted out $12 an hour, make meals from scratch with local ingredients. There's no reason why that beef should be coming from the Amazon rainforest when there's beef farmers right down the road. And just think of what happens to that local community, your community, when all that money is staying locally. And also the food tastes better. I think that's what's so lost in this concentration is the decline in food quality. You give me a pork chop from a hog that was in a KFO versus a hog that just did little hog things on pasture, it's 9-day difference. So on that note, we would like to open it up to questions. I will stop sharing.
We can stop screen sharing. And Rachel, will you tell us when we're out of time?
Yes, absolutely. First, I just want to thank you guys both for all the work that you guys do and all the information and motivation you've shared with us this morning. And I'm also a proud Farmers Union member, so appreciate that pitch as well. We've got about 8 or so questions right now, so just as far as the timing of getting through them all. So we'll start with question 1 was, Austin stated that corn is heavily subsidized. Corn farmers push back against that blanket statement. Can you identify the specific subsidies and the amounts?
Yeah, I mean, crop insurance is 70% subsidized. I mean, heavily subsidized it there. And then you have the price floor with commodity payments. And also, I mean, ethanol is an indirect subsidy. And I say that as the son of an ethanol truck driver, and ethanol paid for my college education. But ethanol is an artificial market. It was an artificial, let me phrase this correctly. It was an artificial demand created to soak up surplus. My biggest fear in the Midwest is it's kind of like that cartoon of Wile E. Coyote. Cars are moving to batteries, yet we're doubling down on corn. I think I just read this morning that we planted a record corn crop. That does not make sense. I mean, to me, the hope is in Iowa, at least in the Midwest, is to take a lot of this corn land and shift it to pasture.
Lauren, did you have anything you wanted to add on that one?
Sorry, you're learning on mute.
All right, well, maybe we'll skip to the next question and then if...
Sorry, I was just waiting because my home phone was ringing and I can't make it be quiet. So I didn't want to make you listen to it, sorry. The one other thing that I would add to that is, like as a grazer, when we purchased our farm, we were automatically, we had the automatic opportunity to enroll in PLC or ARC payments, which were designed based on crop history. And so because our farm had been in corn on corn longer than I had been alive, we received higher subsidy payments on that ground for a set number of years. And then when we got to the new, date where they look at what's planted there and it was pasture, we stopped receiving the same kind of subsidies for that. And so I think there are a little bit maybe more insidious ways in which these subsidies play into people's decision making and access to government funding. So yeah, there are certainly some big ways, but then there are also some really small ways in which your crop history can really impact your bottom line.
Yeah, great additions. Glad we caught you and didn't move on.
Sorry about that.
Question number 2, please comment on Rodale's decision to partner with Cargill to increase organic acreage.
Yeah, and I can't speak to this a whole lot because I haven't been in good communication with Rodale about it. But just looking at the general structure of what we talked about today, these big companies have a lot of power and they have a lot of sway and they have a lot of money. And I think there are a few different ways that people are looking at how to deal with them. There's certainly some folks saying we need to bust this up and make a different system. And there are others who are saying, they're here and they have a lot of authority and power and money, and we can leverage that to create change. And so, that's a decision that everyone has to make. And I know, especially in the nonprofit world, it can be really tricky to figure out how to walk these lines because certainly the individual donations are not necessarily as hefty in the agricultural sphere as the sponsorships from corporations can be. And that doesn't mean that someone's necessarily sold out, but it, I think, is a good question of, how do we resource organizations and good work in order to make sure that people can make the decisions they want to make. And I do think too, there is that question of, do you work with or do you work against? And it takes a lot of different tactics, I think, to create positive change, both in the environmental sector and also in the economic sector. I don't know, do you have anything to add to that, Austin?
You got it all.
I got it all.
Right, the next question was, do you know of any examples on the state level where state legislators have changed policies to better support small farmers, markets, and place restrictions on large companies, maybe in the meat industry, for example?
Do you want to start, Austin, or do you want me to? The first thing.
You go first, yeah, I'll add on to it. Sorry.
I was going to say the first thing that comes to mind to me is the anti-corporate farming laws in North Dakota. And I don't know all the nitty gritty of how those laws have really functioned, but I'm really impressed by the fact that that state has been able to keep them intact for so long and has prioritized that for their family farmers. And certainly there have been a few states, especially with the CARES Act funding for the coronavirus pandemic response, who've created some exciting grant programs for meat processing sector, for example, to try and help alleviate bottlenecks. But yeah, Austin, you probably know more about this on a larger scale than I do.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one because it's like a curse and a blessing where, I mean, Iowa has some anti-corporate farming laws, but basically we have a Packer ban, but we don't enforce it because Smithfield basically came in. It bought, I think it was called Murphy something, a big CAFO operation. And they just overwhelm you with all the lawsuits, and basically the AG cut a deal with them. There's a good book called Meat Racket by Chris Leonard that really gets into the nitty gritty of that battle. But the hard problem is if a state tries to do the right thing, you have another state that will deregulate, and then industry just shifts production there. I mean, Iowa basically deregulated hogs because North Carolina did it first, because there was a state senator that deregulated it. He personally then profited off it, sold his empire to Smithfield. He was that Murphy guy. So that's why I'm kind of like, a lot of this needs to be done at the federal. That said, at the state level, procurement power is what I always latch on to, because sure, it's hard to change things with your personal fork, but school districts have a lot of forks. So just even like a simple thing of not buying JBS or just making it be local meat, I think would just be huge locally.
All right, we'll go on to question number 5 here. Have you looked at the consolidation of small community banks and what that means for farm financing? In particular, what does the data show for rural communities, small family farms, and/or access to financing such as lines of credit?
I'm not an expert in rural banking. I don't know if Austin is, but my thought is that very similar pressures are happening to small banks in the same way that small grocery stores are experiencing these pressures. It's hard to have, basically purchasing power. It's hard to bring on enough staff and have enough infrastructure in terms of building and computers and all of that to run any small business. And I'm sure banking is no exception. So as people expect more and more and have more and more access, I expect that that's hard, but it's certainly not an area of expertise for me.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to Louis Brandeis of just, I want power to concentrate as much as possible, because that local banker, that local bank, locally owned thing, they just have empathy. They understand the pain you're going through. They understand that. Whereas now, like you travel across America, and every downtown mid-sized city has like a 1970s building with the word Wells Fargo on it, and it's just clear they bought out that local bank. All the local banks I grew up with in Iowa, my first bank was Brenton Bank. That's part of the Wells Fargo empire now. And so with the banks so concentrated, Wells Fargo does not care about these little towns. None of their white collar employees usually work in these towns. And so they don't have the empathy that a community banker would have.
Yeah, and I've chosen to, here in Wisconsin, I'm pretty lucky. I've got access to a couple of different credit unions in our area. And so thinking about different ways that we can, not vote with our fork so much, but vote with our bank account, choosing those cooperative models and trying to think about ways in which we can be a little bit more collaborative as communities has been my personal solution.
Yeah, and same here. Like, I don't want to say I vote with my fork, but I also realize the limits of that action. So like, I'm only one person. I have a community, I have a bank at a co-op, credit union, but we need to demand more. I guess that's my bigger point.
All right, well, I'm glad both of you said co-ops, because that's going to lead into our next group of questions. So I'm going to kind of combine a couple here and throw a few at you. So do you see co-ops as a viable way to provide more stability and financial community success, as well as when co-ops partner and collude with other co-ops to cover the entire supply chain with equity and ethics, does that run the risk of price fixing antitrust accusations as a co-op monopoly?
I'll jump in again and then let Austin give his 2 cents as well. I do see co-ops as a very viable option to resolve some of these issues, certainly not all of them. But I do think we have to be careful about what stakeholders are included in the cooperative. So we want to make sure that the people who are needing access to goods or services are on those boards. We want to make sure that they don't just become, a different version of a corporation. And so I think in that regard, we can sometimes kind of walk the line of co-ops turning into something a little bit different if their boards are straying away from mission maybe, or if they're looking more at bottom line as opposed to member needs. It's those same incentive structures that are impacting our entire marketplace. It's capitalism, and it's hard to exist as an altruistic cooperative within a capitalist environment when you're trying to survive in competition. And so, I think it's just really important that if we want those to be viable solutions, we also engage in those solutions to make sure that they're going the direction we want them to and they're doing what we need them to. Do you have any thoughts, Austin?
Honestly, I think you hit it on the head perfectly. I mean, the only thing I would add is, so much of these laws too are a century old, and there's been a lot of mission drift here, and just even updating these rules. I mean, what I go back to is the Packyard and Stockyard Act. Tyson gets away with a lot in poultry because poultry wasn't written into the law because Americans didn't eat a lot of chicken back in 1912. So I mean, we stop trying to make 1912 laws work. I think we should just dust them off and update them.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think you guys kind of touched on this, but I'll repeat it anyway. Should the non-farming consumers among us be establishing food co-ops to sidestep the retail concentration and provide alternate sales channels for farmers? And are there other roles in this for the consumer?
Well, I'll maybe just, we've talked about co-ops a bit now, so maybe I'll focus on, are there other roles for the consumer? And yes, there are a lot of roles. As a small scale producer myself, I appreciate anyone who's willing to buy directly from me and help me capture as much of the retail dollar as possible, or buy from a smaller shop that I sell to who's willing to help them stay alive and be a marketplace for me. And so, there's certainly that kind of vote with your fork piece of it. But I would go even a little bit further than that and say, get to know your farmers and talk to them about what are the issues impacting them, because agriculture is complex. And for anyone on the call who is a farmer, that's an understatement at best. But there are so many things that just aren't black and white, aren't clear, are much more insidious and much more of a barrier than we want them to be. And the more that you can understand that and be an advocate for that, and help spread the word to other people, to your own network, about some of these issues that are being faced, like with the climate change issue, farmers aren't the problem only, right? They're also part of the solution. And helping people to understand the nuance of different types of farms and different types of farmers and different types of practices can really help that conversation go a long way. So it isn't black and white of either farmer or environmentalist, for example. There's a lot of overlap between those two. So I would say, certainly educate yourself and get involved in the food system. If you have a local co-op, that's a great place to spend your money and to spend your energy. But also, just get to know those people and ask them what they need, because the farmers in your community might need something drastically different than the farmers in my community.
It's a little bit of just a side note, but just hearing Lauren talk made me remember, regardless if you're an eater or a farmer, what I really encourage people to do too is, given the complexity of farming in these agriculture markets, is don't be afraid to approach a journalist with stories. You have to keep in mind, a journalist is just a storyteller. And if we don't tell these stories don't get told. So, especially with the hollowing out of local media because of Google and Facebook sucking out all the advertising money, a lot of these stories at local level aren't being told. And so, if you see market abuse or if you see bad actors behaving, let a journalist know. Reach out to them. Or if you see a story and they just, all they do is quote Farm Bureau, yada, 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 instead of being angry on Twitter at the journalist, send them a nice email and say, hey, you should really talk. Here's some people at Moses, or here's some farmers, here's some, just I think letting them know, because a lot of these people too are not making a lot of money and they have to move a mile a minute. And so I think just elevating our stories is so important, because in the day, especially in antitrust is a political thing. So much of this conversation over big tech happened because all the stories on Facebook. And so, I mean, part of that is just highlighting these stories to raise the public awareness, so then we can move the ball forward.
You guys both made some really great points. And I was going to say Farmers Union also is always looking for farmer stories too. So I'll give the Farmers Union plug so Lauren can sit back this time. All right, the next question was, at the recent Sustainable Farming Association conference, Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison did a talk about his desire to address antitrust in Minnesota agriculture. Do you know of other politicians or political allies that can help?
I'm a little bit less familiar probably with the Minnesota political landscape, but I would say that there have been a few champions of antitrust issues on a national level. I know Booker and Klobuchar have both put forward bills in the past or currently around antitrust enforcement. And again, Austin, this is probably way more your sphere than it is mine.
I just dropped my avocado. I was playing
that come to mind.
Booker and Warnock, the new senator from Georgia, this introduced a new bill for Black farmers, but what's hidden in it was updating the Backyard and Stockyards Act. From everything I heard about the Iowa caucuses, critiques aside, is that Booker found that really informative in agriculture, of just seeing, I don't think people on the coast realize how broken some of these markets are, and just seeing this up close really, that's why he's been such a champion, is, I don't want to say he got enlightened, but I mean, even in Iowa, I don't think urban Iowa realizes what a true confinement operation is and what it entails. And then Rosa Delario of New Haven actually is incredible in this space. She's done a lot in beef markets. It's not gotten a lot of attention, but this is a good example of, she has a young staffer who is a beef farmer down in central Illinois. And, what happens when, he's always in the back of her ear telling her, educating her about this. And she comes from a worker background, caring about the slaughterhouse workers. And so just marrying those two has really helped her elevate that. And she's also now chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, a very, very important committee. So I just want to put that little plug out there.
Yeah, and when it comes to meat processing, I know we certainly have some friends in Montana as well. So I think there's a lot of power and potential partnerships in these issues, but we have to think about everyone's incentives and what are the pieces of antitrust enforcement that speak to them, because it is, like I said, a wicked problem. It's in a lot of areas, and not everybody sees it the same way. So trying to find those overlaps of shared interest is a great potential for figuring out where we get enough power to actually make these changes.
Totally, and I should also, just full disclosure, is I'm a failed politician. I ran for Congress in Iowa before age 30. I mean, let's be very honest, is once you start talking about corporate power in this deregulated campaign finance system, you unleash so much dark money at you. So that's the scary thing here, is the second you say Tyson's is too big, there's a check cut from Tyson's to a dark money group that will attack the politician. And so, that's the thing here, is also being strategic of who we go after. And also the politicians, the risk they take. I mean, Senator Baldwin in Wisconsin that will always be a competitive seat and a very expensive race. And so once you start talking about consolidation is, just understanding that the market forces we live in and the braveness that requires of our politicians, and also rewarding the politicians that are exhibiting braveness.
Yeah, and I should reiterate the fact that Wisconsin Farmers Union is a nonpartisan organization. And so, we're always thinking about what is the potential for collaboration and growing power here, as opposed to, which side of an aisle is going to be our friend on an issue. So it's a little bit of a different way of thinking than maybe the politician mindset, but it's a good one for us farmers.
You got one of each here on this talk.
All right, from politics to parity pricing, with sentiment growing amongst farmers and farm organizations like the Holstein Association Farm Bureau for supply management and parity pricing, how realistic is it to imagine it might actually make it into federal legislation?
Well, I'm just saying I've got my fingers crossed. There are a lot of people working hard on this project of, certainly an overarching goal of supply management at some point, but also some smaller goals about how do we get there? Because it's a big first step to take. And there's some great conversations going on between organizations that are very unlikely bedfellows, between people who often disagree on a lot of issues. So I'm an optimist, and I think we have a shot. But I also know it's a pretty uphill battle, and can use all the resources it can get. So if you've got energy for this, I invite you in.
I'm not a fan of Farm Bureau. Let's figure out how to say that. There's some organizations in the agriculture space that are friends of farmers, and the other ones that are basically suburban insurance companies pretending to be the voice of farmers. I put Farm Bureau in that second camp. This is my own research I've written on this is they have investments in a lot of these corporations. So they push policies that benefit these concentrated industries. I know the Wisconsin Farm Bureau is a different thing. Iowa Farm Bureau is a different entity. The Iowa Farm Bureau is the single largest farmer organization in the world, in America. It has about $120 million a year operating budget. For all the nonprofit leaders on this space, imagine if you had a state chapter with that much money.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I have to go back to where do we have some common ground, because I have to imagine that there's some common ground in there somewhere. I know a lot of Farm Bureau members who have more in common with me than I like to think. Yeah. And there's certainly a difference often between leadership and membership. So
and I think that's key. No one thinks that a company, the corn seed market should be this concentrated. I think, what did I mean, you saw it with the dairy checkoffs when you have the executives making $1 million as a lot of people are going out of business. There's a disconnect between the members and the leadership. And I think that's where the power we have is to tell journalists these stories. Sarah Lloyd on this call in the Wisconsin Farmers Union to me has been a champion in this space of just showing, it's a classic thing in the nonprofit space, mission drift, and just holding leaders to accountable. And that is the beauty of democracy and journalism is there's nothing like disclosing, putting light into a dark space and shining it to really right the wrongs. Yeah, sorry. That's a little bit of a tangent, I know.
That's all right, you've got the mic. So, all right, we'll move on to the next question what is the potential of farmer labor collaboration getting ahead in fiber hemp production, manufacturing, product innovation to prevent this new organic egg-based industry going the way of subsidized concentrated commodities?
I don't have any specifics on what's going on in hemp fiber, but I do know in Wisconsin we have a pretty wonderful CBD hemp co-op that's involved with Wisconsin Farmers Union that is basically trying to address this issue of farmer power within vertical integration, a vertically integrated sector. That's what I'm trying to say. So trying to hold their power through cooperation and make space for themselves to not get taken advantage of in the way that a lot of other farmers have been taken advantage of by the corporations and more seedy folks who've moved into that sector. And I know that there are folks within that group and within Wisconsin Farmers Union and other states' farmers unions who are really interested in supporting the fiber aspect of hemp production. But yeah, I don't have any details on it.
No, either.
Okay, well, moving right back into subsidies. Please say more on subsidies. Would the best course of action be to eliminate all subsidies, end subsidies for row crops that feed into highly processed foods, phase them out, add subsidies for specialty crops or food?
My personal opinion, I'm not speaking for any organization, is I would prefer to move, I don't like picking winners or losers. I prefer to move to a stewardship payment model of here's the toolkit. You do cover crops, you get money. If you do buffer strips, you get this. Just kind of let each farmer, each piece of land's different. Each farmer knows what's best for their land. What I also want to say though is those three programs I talked about, they're about the same size as a school meal program in terms of dollars, which I kind of blew my mind personally. So imagine if we just took the school meal thing, we doubled it. Instead of spending $2 or $3 per kid on a meal, we spent $6. But imagine if we greatly improved the food quality and we did a lot of the sustainable practices. Because putting an organic green pepper in a Dollar General isn't going to change anything if people's incomes are declining. But if we guarantee those contracts with schools, I mean, that would be huge in the supply chain ramifications. Because I mean, to me, I view this antitrust. I mean, it took us decades to get to this moment. It's going to take, if we're being honest with ourselves, decades to move to a new system. But as we move that needle, I think using that will really help. But that's just my personal opinion. I mean, so much of the Senate is and the House is where are the votes.
Yeah, and certainly as a grazer and a former staff person of Moses and someone who's involved in Farmers Union, I'm a huge fan of supporting people for good practices. And I think that would go a long way in kind of adjusting how our agricultural sphere looks, particularly on its impact on our water quality and our communities. So I personally appreciate that, but I'm not enough of an expert on the intricacies of subsidies to know the best ways to move forward with what we currently have and not leave farmers holding a bag, because I know there are a lot of farmers who are pretty dependent on the structure as it is as well. And that's, again, a much larger structural issue that doesn't say anything about those farmers. It says that we've put people in a position where they're dependent on a subsidy. So as we look at different ways to maybe make changes over time, I'd want to make sure that we don't leave people behind.
Yeah, and that's my fear right now. You're seeing this is anger going after certain farmers, especially the larger farmer operations, where it's all part of a bigger thing. A lot of people are just responding to. I mean, that's the way the incentives are. You know, if the margins are so low, you have to get big. You have to increase your herd size, increase your grain production. In the day, this is all about, you know, the system's designed for Cargill, not for these people. These people are responding the way they have to save their farm.
All right, we've got one more comment and then we'll go to closing remarks. One comment was, consumers have the ultimate power over the situation because we vote with every dollar we spend. Think of the power of consumer boycott campaigns.
Yeah, I think we all have, like I was saying earlier, a place of power, and in these huge mega structures that take away power, it gets really easy to forget that you do have power in these situations, and that if we combine our power, we're a lot more dangerous. And I say that in a good way, you know. So I like to think about how everyone's power is a little bit different, and how each of us bring different skills and knowledge base and networks into this big problem. And so that's why I'm always giving the call that if this is something that interests you, or if you feel like it's impacting you, get involved, get organized, you know, join this problem solution task force here and try and make some changes, because you know, we're going to be in it until we change it, and each of us has a way in which we can be part of the solution.
Yeah, and to me, it's all part of an action plan. Is you know, boycotting, but the next step then has to be changing structures, because the classic corporate tactic is to, you know, wade you out. You know, passion, you only have passion for so long. I'm personally writing an article right now on the rise of a pig baron. I'll let you guess which one. And that's what I saw in Iowa. I mean, the 90s was there was a rural rebellion against CAFOs. And what you see classically, what industry will do is, let's have a study. Now, let's talk about it next year. And don't accept the delay tactics. Demand change now. Push structures now. When the heat is in the moment, when the fire is there, because it's just, yeah, that's just like personal thing I've learned just doing historical research is that tactic.
All right, and then I do have one question that I had missed that I'm going to try to get you guys to touch on real quick. What about land ownership land ownership consolidation interact with industry consolidation? Sorry.
Austin, you want to take the first stab?
Yeah, I mean, it's most land in Iowa now that's farmed the person farming doesn't own the land. I mean, you see you see it. I mean, grandma and grandpa die, kids live in Denver, they put it in a trust, and then, you rent it out to the neighbor, and you can always clock that land, especially when the prices are low. They farm right up to the creek. You know what I mean? There's just the tall tale signs when you drive on a county road where you can just tell it's rented land and the care's not there. I just don't, I know this is one of the few things I'll agree on with Senator Grassley. It's just like so much of these, if we're going to have these subsidies, whatever these support systems, these conservation payments, it really needs to be tied to the land, who operates the land. Because if we allow this absentee land ownership to grow and consolidate, to me, it's scary for rural communities. I mean, you're having now, retirement funds, LLCs, Chicago investors buying land. Like none of this is not the agriculture system that I don't think we want. But that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on investment firms. That's an issue in my area. Investment firms are buying up land, and we talk about access to land for beginning farmers or smaller scale farmers who are hoping to expand or add a hayfield. You can't do that if you're competing against an investment firm with a lot of money. It's driving up prices, it's driving down our communities, and I think it's a huge problem. Again, it's very complicated, and the transparency is also a big piece of this. Here in Wisconsin, we have laws around foreign ownership, for example, but there are a lot of ways to kind of hide ownership through different layers of LLCs and who owns stock in what, and I think land ownership is not only problematic from a cultural standpoint and, where we got the land in the first place and how it's being treated and what our goals are as a larger community for having sustainable environments. But it's also a problem for our economics in our rural communities. So a wicked problem for sure. And I don't have the right answer other than I don't like it and I want it to stop.
I mean, I would just add on to it. I mean, going back to someone's question earlier about bank consolidation it's a lot easier for the investment firms to get loans now than the farmer as banks consolidate. And so you're seeing consolidate. It's like this weird thing with consolidation is they compound each other. And so like what I always going back to the alcohol example and prohibition is make rules as simple as possible because lawyers make money off complexity. You will always find a lawyer who'll find some little wormhole. And so just making like no foreign corporation can own a farmland. It's a very clear rule that everyone can understand, and you can't lawyer, do that kind of game with it. And so as we think about that, I mean, that's what's kind of happened with a lot of this farmland is, well, if it's an LLC and if this person's doing this, once you start playing that game, it gets really, really hard. People profit off complexity.
All right, well, thank you both so much. Any closing remarks? And also I wanted to thank all the participants for the awesome questions.
Yeah, thank you, certainly everyone. And I just invite you as you go forth into your days and weeks and months ahead, look for all the ways in which consolidation and antitrust issues impact you. It's underlying so many surprising places that cause us struggle and strife. And I just invite you to look at it with a little bit of a new lens and think about how we can start to resolve this. And thank you all for your time.
Yeah, I just want to add on saying, honestly, it's a true honor to speak at Moses. My campaign manager was actually told me when I ran, told me about Moses when I first heard about it. So hopefully I can attend in person one day. I would love an excuse to drive the Great River Road. My favorite part of Iowa is that McGregor Prairie Machine area. I just think it's very pretty. So.
All right, bravo, guys.
Yeah, take care.
Take care, everybody. And feel free to reach out to us on email.